Good afternoon. Welcome to another reading from White Fragility, Why It's So Hard to Talk to White People About Racism by Robin DiAngelo. Today we're going to dive into Chapter 3 together. Let's see, the title of Chapter 3 is Racism After the Civil Rights Movement. Let's go ahead and just begin. We open with several quotes. Children today are so open. When the old folks die off, we will finally be free of racism. I grew up in a small rural community, so I was very sheltered. I didn't learn anything about racism. I judge people by what they do, not who they are. I don't see color. I see people. We are all red under the skin. I marched in the 60s. New racism is a term coined by film professor Martin Barker to capture the ways in which racism has adapted over time so that modern norms, policies, and practices result in similar racial outcomes as those in the past, while not appearing to be explicitly racist. Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva captures this dynamic in the title of his book, Racism Without Racists: Colorblind Racism and the Persistence of Racial Inequality in America. He says that though virtually no one claims to be racist anymore, racism still exists. How is that possible? Racism can still exist because it is highly adaptive, she says. Because of this adaptability, we must be able to identify how it changes over time. For example, after a white nationalist march and the murder of a counter-protester, the President of the United States said that there are very fine people on both sides. That is a quote. This comment would have been unthinkable from a high-ranking public official just a few years ago. Yet, if we asked the President if he was a racist, I am confident he would reply with a resounding no. In fact, he recently stated that he was the least racist person one could ever meet. In this chapter, I review various ways that racism has adapted over time to continue to produce racial disparity while it exempts virtually all white people from any involvement in or benefit from racism. All systems of oppression are adaptive. They can withstand and adjust to challenges and still maintain inequality. Take, for instance, the federal recognition of same-sex marriage and accommodations for people with disabilities. While the overall systems of heterosexism and ableism are still with us, they have adapted in limited ways. These adaptations are held up as reassurance to those who fought long and hard for a particular change that equality has now been achieved. These milestones, such as the recognition of same-sex marriage and the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title IX, the election of Barack Obama, these are, of course, significant and worthy of celebration. But systems of oppression are deeply rooted and not overcome by the simple passage of legislation. Advances are also tenuous, as we can see in recent challenges to the rights of LGBTQI, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, and intersex people. Systems of oppression are not completely inflexible, but they are far less flexible than popular ideology would acknowledge, and the collective impact of the inequitable distribution of resources continues across history. Subtitle: Colorblind Racism. What is termed colorblind racism is an example of racism's ability to adapt to cultural changes. Ideology, if we pretend not to notice race, then there can be no racism. The idea is based on a line from the famous "I Have a Dream" speech given by Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963 during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. At the time of King's speech, it was much more socially acceptable for white people to admit to their racial prejudices and their belief in white racial superiority. But many white people had never witnessed the kind of violence to which blacks were subjected. Because the struggle for civil rights was televised, whites across the nation watched in horror as black men, women, and children were attacked by police dogs and fire hoses during peaceful protests, and beaten and dragged away from lunch counters. Once the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, a landmark civil rights and U.S. labor law that outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, it became less acceptable for white people to admit to racial prejudice. They did not want to be associated with the racist acts that they had witnessed on television. In addition, was the fact that discrimination was now illegal. One line of King's speech in particular, that one day he might be judged by the content of his character and not the color of his skin, was seized upon by the white public because the words were seen to provide a simple and immediate solution to racial tensions. Pretend that we don't see race, and racism will end. Color blindness was now promoted as the remedy for racism, and white people insisting they don't see race, or if they did, it had no meaning to them. With white people insisting they didn't see race, or if they did, that it had no meaning to them personally. Clearly, the civil rights movement did not end racism, nor have claims of colorblindness. But reducing King's work to this simplistic idea illustrates how movements for social change are co-opted, stripped of their initial challenge, and used against the very cause from which they originated. For example, a common response in the name of colorblindness is to declare that an individual who says that race matters is the one who is racist. In other words, it is racist to acknowledge race. Consider colorblind ideology from the perspective of a person of color. An example I often share occurred when I was co-leading a workshop with an African American man. A white participant said to him, "I don't see race. I don't see you as black." My co-trainer's response was, "Then how will you see racism?" He then explained to her that he was black. He was confident that she could see this, and that his race meant that he had a very different experience in life than she did. If she was ever going to understand or challenge racism, she would need to acknowledge this difference. Pretending that she didn't notice that he was black was not helpful to him in any way, as it denied his reality. Indeed, it refused his reality, and kept hers insular and unchallenged. This pretense that she did not notice his race assumed that he was just like her, and in so doing, she projected her reality onto him. For example, "I feel welcome at work, so you must too. I have never felt that my race mattered, so you must feel that yours doesn't either." But of course, we do see the race of other people, and race holds deep social meaning for us. We might think of conscious racial awareness as the tip of an iceberg, the superficial aspects of our racial socialization. Our intentions, always good, and what we are supposed to acknowledge seeing, nothing. Meanwhile, under the surface is the massive depth of racial socialization. Messages, beliefs, images, associations, internalized superiority and entitlement, perceptions and emotions. Colorblind ideology makes it difficult for us to address these unconscious beliefs. While the idea of colorblindness may have started out as a well-intentioned strategy for interrupting racism, in practice, it has served to deny the reality of racism and thus hold it in place. Racial bias is largely unconscious, and herein lies the deepest challenge, the defensiveness that ensues upon any suggestion of racial bias. This defensiveness is classic white fragility because it protects our racial bias while simultaneously affirming that our identities are open-minded. Yes, it is uncomfortable to be confronted with an aspect of ourselves that we don't like, but we cannot change what we refuse to see. Countless studies show empirically that people of color are discriminated against in the workplace. Imagine you had empirical evidence that your coworker was unintentionally discriminating against people of color during the hiring process. Given your belief in equality, you would probably think that it was imperative to inform the person so that he or she could stop. You pointed this discrimination out in the most diplomatic way possible. And still, what do you think your colleague's response would be? Would you hear gratitude that you had brought this fact to the person's attention? Probably not. More likely, your coworker would respond with hurt, anger, and defensiveness, insisting that he or she had not racially discriminated, but had chosen the most qualified candidates. And the individual would sincerely believe this to be true, even though you had empirical evidence that it was not. The defensiveness is rooted in the false but widespread belief that racial discrimination can only be intentional. Our lack of understanding about implicit bias leads to aversive racism. If you see me slap my hands, it's because there's a little mosquito buzzing around in here. Excuse me. Subhead, aversive racism. Aversive racism is a manifestation of racism that well-intentioned people who see themselves as educated and progressive are more likely to exhibit. It exists under the surface of consciousness because it conflicts with consciously held beliefs of racial equality and justice. Aversive racism is subtle, but insidious. And as aversive racists enact racism in ways that allow them to maintain a positive self-image, for example, I have lots of friends of color. I judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Whites enact racism while maintaining a positive self-image in many ways, and here's a list. Rationalizing racial segregation as unfortunate but necessary to access good schools. Rationalizing that our workplaces are virtually all white because people of color just don't apply. Avoiding direct racial language and using racially coded terms such as urban, underprivileged, diverse, sketchy, and good neighborhoods. Denying that we have cross-racial relationships denying that we have few cross-racial relationships by proclaiming how diverse our community or workplace is. Attributing inequality between whites and people of color to causes other than racism. And as an example on that one, DiAngelo goes on. Consider a conversation I had with a white friend. She was telling me about a white couple she knew who had just moved to New Orleans and bought a house for a mere $25,000. Of course, she immediately added, they also had to buy a gun, and Joan is afraid to leave the house. I immediately knew they had bought a home in a black neighborhood. This was a moment of white racial bonding between this couple who shared the story of racial danger and my friend, and then between my friend and me as she shared with me, as she repeated the story. Through this tale, the four of us fortified familiar images of the horror of black space and drew boundaries between us and them without ever having to directly name race or openly express our disdain for black space. Notice that the need for a gun is a key part of this story. It would not have the degree of social capital it holds if the emphasis were on the price of the house alone. Rather, the story's emotional power rests on why a house would be that cheap. Because it is in a black neighborhood where white people literally might not get out alive. Yet while very negative and stereotypical representations of black were reinforced in that exchange, not naming race provided plausible deniability. In fact, Preparing to share this incident, I texted my friend and asked her the name of the city her friends had moved to. I also wanted to confirm my assumption that she was talking about a black neighborhood. I share the text exchange here. Hey, what city did you say your friends had bought a house in for $25,000? New Orleans. They said they live in a very bad neighborhood and they each have to have a gun to protect themselves. I wouldn't pay 5 cents for that neighborhood. I assume it's a black neighborhood? Yes, you get what you pay for. I'd rather pay $500,000 and live somewhere I wasn't afraid. I wasn't asking because I wanted to live there. I'm writing about this in my book, the way that white people talk about race without ever coming out and talking about race. I wouldn't want you to live there. It's too far away from me. Notice that when I simply ask what city the house is in, she repeats the story about the neighborhood being so bad that her friends need guns. When I ask if the neighborhood is black, she is comfortable confirming that it is. But when I tell her that I am interested in how whites talk about race without talking about race, she switches the narrative. Now her concern is about not wanting me to live so far away. This is a classic example of aversive racism, holding deep racial disdain that surfaces in daily discourse, but not being able to admit it because the disdain conflicts with our self-image and professed beliefs. Readers may be asking themselves, but if the neighborhood is really dangerous, why is acknowledging this danger a sign of racism? Research in implicit bias has shown that perceptions of criminal activity are influenced by race. White people will perceive danger simply by the presence of black people. We cannot trust our perceptions when it comes to race and crime. This seems like an important thing right now. I'm going to repeat that. White people will perceive danger simply by the presence of black people. We cannot trust our perceptions when it comes to race and crime. But regardless of whether the neighborhood is actually more or less dangerous than other neighborhoods, what is salient about this exchange is how it functions racially and what that means for the white people engaged in it. For my friend and me, this conversation did not increase our awareness of the danger of some specific neighborhood. Rather, the exchange reinforced our fundamental beliefs about black people. Toni Morrison uses the term race talk to capture the explicit insertion into everyday life of racial signs and symbols that have no meaning other than positioning African Americans into the lowest level of the racial hierarchy. Casual race talk is a key component of white racial framing because it accomplishes the interconnected goals of elevating whites while demeaning people of color. Race talk always implies a racial us and them. Consider an experience I had with aversive racism. My last academic position was in a state I had never been to before my interview. Throughout the 3 days of interviewing, other white people warned me not to buy a home in Springfield or Holyoke if I took the position, especially if I had children. While no one openly named race, the racial coding was not lost on me. I now knew where the people of color were concentrated in the area. At the same time, because no one directly mentioned race, we could all deny that this is what we were actually talking about. Returning to my hotel room the first night, I looked up the demographics. Sure enough, Springfield and Holyoke had significantly high populations, close to 50%, of black and brown people. Starting on day one of my visit, my fellow whites had communicated the racial boundaries to me. My teacher education students also engaged in race talk, reinforcing the boundaries between us and them while positioning us as superior. They engaged in race talk when they expressed fear about being placed in dangerous neighborhoods while describing their hometowns as sheltered. These depictions are relentlessly strengthened by news stories that position violent crime committed in primarily white suburban communities as shocking, yet claiming that one has grown up in a sheltered environment raises a question that begs to be answered. Sheltered from what? And in contrast to whom? If we grow up in environments with few, if any, people of color, are we not in fact less sheltered from racist conditioning because we have to rely on narrow and repetitive media representations, jokes, omissions, and warnings for our understanding of people of color? Conversely, positioning white spaces as sheltered and those who are raised in them as racially innocent taps into classic narratives of people of color as not innocent. Racist images and resultant white fears can be found at all levels of society, and myriad studies demonstrate that whites believe that people of color, and blacks in particular, are dangerous. Whites rarely considered how sheltered and safe their spaces may be from the perspective of people of color. For example, Trayvon Martin's experience in a gated community, a gated white community. Because it reverses the actual direction of racial danger, this narrative may be one of the most pernicious. When you consider the moral judgment we make about people we deem as racist in our society, the need to deny our own racism, even to ourselves, is understandable. It makes sense. We believe we are superior at a deeply internalized level, and we act on this belief in the practice of our lives. But we must deny this belief to fit into society and maintain our self-identity as good, moral people. Unfortunately, aversive racism only protects racism, because we can't challenge our racial filters if we can't consider the possibility that we have them. Of course, some whites do explicitly avow racism. We might consider these whites actually more aware of and honest about their biases than those of us who consider ourselves open-minded, yet who have rarely thought critically about the biases we inevitably hold or how we may be expressing them. Subhead: Cultural Racism. The body of research about children and race demonstrates that white children develop a sense of white superiority as early as preschool. This early start shouldn't be surprising, as society sends constant messages that to be white is better than to be a person of color. Despite the claims of many white young adults that racism is in the past and that they were taught to see everyone as equal, research shows otherwise. For example, polls sponsored by MTV in 2014 show that millennials profess more tolerance and a deeper commitment to equality and fairness than previous generations did. At the same time, millennials are committed to an ideal of colorblindness that leaves them uncomfortable with and confused about race and opposed to measures to reduce racial inequality. Perhaps most significantly, 41% of white millennials believe that government pays too much attention to minorities, and 48% believe that discrimination against whites is as big a problem as discrimination against people of color. Many in this generation claim that the election of Many in this generation claim that the election of Barack Obama as president shows that we are post-racial. These polls were conducted before the presidency of Donald Trump, but as his election has made clear, we are far from post-racial, keeping in mind that this was written 2 years ago. Another significant study that was based on the practices of millennials rather than their claims was conducted by sociologists Leslie Pica and Joe Fegan. They asked 626 white college students at 28 colleges across the United States to keep journals and record every instance of racial issues, racial images, and racial understanding that they observed or were part of for 6 to 8 weeks. The students recorded more than 7,500 accounts of blatantly racist comments and actions by the white people in their lives, friends, families, acquaintances, strangers. These accounts come from the generation most likely to claim that they were taught to see everyone as equal, those who grew up in the age of colorblind ideology after the Civil Rights Movement. Pica and Fegan's study proves empirical evidence, Pica and Fegan's study provides empirical evidence that racism continues to be explicitly expressed by whites, even those who are young and profess to be progressive. Consider these examples from their study. As I sit in a room with a bunch of frat guys, Phil walks in chanting, "Rachi, Rachi, Rachi." I ask, what... Please note, this is a content warning. This next section does consider does use the N-word, and I am going to read it as it is presented. As I sit in a room with a bunch of frat guys, Phil walks in, chanting, "Rachi, Rachi, Rachi." I ask what that term means, and I am answered with a giggle and a quick, "It's slang for nigger, like niggerachi." I lean. Robbie was there telling a joke. He glanced to see if anybody was around. He starts, "A black man, a Latin man, and a white guy find a magical lamp on the beach." Racist joke ensues. I thought it was pretty funny, and I wasn't the only one. But I'm glad he waited till no one was around to tell it. If you didn't know Robbie, you might misunderstand. Ashley. Several common dynamics are illustrated in the thousands of examples Pica and Fegan collected. The first is how much explicit racism young people are exposed to and participate in. The second is the idea that if someone is a good person, he or she cannot be racist, as demonstrated in the student's note that if someone overheard, the person might misunderstand Robbie. This sort of racism makes for a very challenging dynamic, in which whites are operating under the false assumption that we can't be simultaneously good people and participate in racism, at the same time that we are dishonest about what we really think and do regarding people of color. The study also reveals a consistent pattern in how these comments and actions were expressed. The majority of incidents occurred in what the researchers describe as the backstage, an all-white company. Further, they found that whites involved in these incidents most often played predictable roles. Typically, there was a protagonist who initiated the racist act, a cheerleader who encouraged it through laughter or agreement, the spectators who stood in silence, and very rarely a dissenter who objected. Virtually all dissenters were subjected to a form of peer pressure in which they were told that it was only a joke and they should lighten up. The researchers document that in front stage settings, those in which people of color were present, the white students displayed a range of racially conscious behaviors, including the following: acting overly nice, avoiding contact, for example, crossing a street or not going to a particular bar or club, mimicking black mannerisms and speech, being careful not to use racial terms or labels, using code words to talk negatively about people of color, and occasional violence directed at people of color. In backstage settings where people of color were not present, white students often used humor to reinforce racial stereotypes about people of color, especially blacks. Pica and Fegan argue that the purpose of these backstage performances is to create white solidarity and to reinforce the ideology of white and male supremacy. This behavior keeps racism circulating, albeit in less formal but perhaps more powerful ways than in the past. Today, we have a cultural norm that insists we hide our racism from people of color and deny it among ourselves, but not that we actually challenge it. In fact, we are socially penalized for challenging racism. I am often asked if I think the younger generation is less racist. No, I don't. In some ways, racism's adaptations over time are more sinister than the concrete rules such as Jim Crow. The adaptations produce the same outcome. People of color are blocked from moving forward, but have been put in place by a dominant white society that won't or can't admit to its beliefs. This this intransigence results in another pillar of white fragility, the refusal to know. That feels like a good place to stop today. And as my end note, I would just like to say that I have thought much about the fact that my choice of book to read first was by a white author, Robin DiAngelo, on a topic that involves so much people of color, black folks and Latinx and all those folks. I do want to say that one of the reasons that I chose this book is in a somewhat shamefacedly, I will say, I believe that for most white audiences, whether we want to admit so to ourselves or not, there is something about hearing a white author speak that adds authority to this. I know that there are many people who would read books by authors of color, and there is always a little small hesitation in the back of the mind. Well, but maybe they're just mad at us. Maybe they've got an axe to grind. Well, maybe so, but that doesn't mean they're not the best experienced people to talk about this. The next book that I do plan to read is going to be How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And so I hope that by sharing this book by a white author, I am hopefully lifting up what our white privilege is supposed to do. We white folks, we got to call each other out on this stuff. Robin DiAngelo does an amazing job of that, and I hope that I am able to pass some of that on to you so that you in turn can go out and use your white privilege to educate other white folks. But I do think it's important to acknowledge and recognize that the choosing of a white author for my first reading was somewhat pandering to white fragility. I am aware of that. I am not sure how quite to address it, but I hope that at least you're thinking about that as you listen and go about your daily lives with this information in the forefront of your mind now. So thank you so much, and I'll see you tomorrow.